Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Krista Clear, our SEC compliance-based educational podcast brought to you by Compliance YOUniversity, a service of Focus One Associates. We're really looking forward to share with you what we think is some timely and relevant information. So let's jump in. So today, we recorded a special episode just for you. On March 18th, Krista and I teamed up with SS&C Advent to host a webinar called CCO Speaks, where we had a panel of CCOs on to discuss their recent SEC exams. Our two panelists were Abe Frieden from Capital Counsel and Jeff Kearns from Kearns & Associates. Both CCOs talked about the very first time they were contacted by the SEC, then walked us all the way through their examination. Throughout the webinar, we opened up the chat box for questions, and the response was so great we decided to answer any additional questions in a podcast. Following me are 3 interviews, one with Abe, then with Jeff, and finally, we'll finish with Krista. Alongside this podcast, we've included a supplement with the questions that we've asked our panelists in this podcast. Those questions also include a time reference so you can easily jump back to a specific answer. We hope this provides some valuable insight into the current state of the SEC exams, and also, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out. And with that, let's jump right into our interview with Jeff. Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk with us today. We really appreciate it.
Good afternoon. Good to be here.
All right. Well, we have a few things to get into today, Jeff. So let's start with the first question. What was their, meaning the SEC's, position or scrutiny as to whether non-discretionary assets counted as RAUM?
Sure. I think it's a good question. We actually spent quite a bit of time going over that with the SEC. There's some things that may be unique to my firm, that we have, 3 major families and, we deal with their assets. And there's some interesting conversations on whether it's AUM or AUA, kind of account by account. You just have to have documentation and an understanding of the regulatory requirements. But I think that they were satisfied with our explanations on any kind of questions. They didn't go too deep in each individual account. It was more broad, but they definitely spent quite a bit of time on asset verification and then questioning on some kind of our methodology.
Great, thank you. RAUM versus AUM has really been a hot topic these last few months, so I think people will really find this helpful. Now, our next question kind of asks about the general course of the exam. The SEC has said they are doing risk-based exams. Can you confirm that was your experience? And did you try to remediate any issues that came up during the exam? And then, if so, how did the SEC view those efforts?
Sure. I think what I'll start by saying is that when we were initially notified, the head examiner stated that, they couldn't tell us if it was, at risk or if there was a complaint or if this was just a routine exam. But from the information that they forwarded it seemed pretty routine. And I think that even though they're saying risk-based, for us at least, I think it was a routine exam. And then when it comes to issues that came up and fixing them, I think that they were, we were working in concert during that period because our exam was so long; it was almost 9 months. So it was in our interest to kind of fix some of the things while we were going along, and they seemed, it's hard to really get a gauge, but they seemed to be amenable to that and were appreciative to some degree. And then at the end, it made things much easier when they sent, when we did the final exit interview. Basically everything that they had talked about in their letter, we had already fixed.
Okay, so it seems like it would be helpful to the SEC and to your firm to fix any issues as they arise. Now, let's dive into the specifics of the exam a little bit deeper. Our next question is, did your exams include any items regarding cybersecurity?
It did. I'll say it in kind of two ways. One was that there was a focus on business continuity, and that had to do with our exam began at the end of May. And that was kind of in the throes of the pandemic. So they were concerned about, I think, operations of how firms were dealing with that, and because it was so new. And, while they were stating, well, we didn't, you don't have to have at this point, a pandemic policy, I think it was helpful if you did. And so I think luckily with that, our organization is small. So we were decentralized in nature. It was all documented in our business continuity plan on how that would work. Obviously the pandemic was kind of a unique experience, but the outcome was basically the same. But the cybersecurity aspect popped up quite a bit. Just on they were concerned about how we were securing our data. So I think that was definitely interesting. Like I said, we're fortunate in a way that we're decentralized, so we're not having to worry about employees all over the place or all over the world, and having to make sure that data isn't leaking out through unsecured Wi-Fi and things of that nature.
Oh, definitely. Maintaining awareness of cybersecurity has become such an important topic this past year, and really it's hard to stress enough that you just can't be too prepared and too aware of what's out there. Now, Jeff, that was our last question for today. And again, I really just want to say thank you so much for your participation. We really had a great time at the webinar, and I think your insight has provided a valuable resource to so many people. So thank you, Jeff.
Well, you're welcome, and good luck to all those that are going through this process. And all I'll say is, just take a deep breath, and everything will work out fine.
Exactly, and that is some wonderful advice for anyone undergoing an SEC exam. And with that, we're going to move on into Abe's interview. Hey, Abe, how's it going? Thank you for taking the time to answer a few follow-up questions.
Thanks for having me, Caleb. Glad to be here.
Of course. We really appreciate your time. Now, let's get right into our first question. So, what was the exam focus relating to best execution?
Best execution wasn't really a major focus area, I don't think, of the exam. The SEC collected our trade blotter, which covered the entire exam period, so that was a calendar year. And presumably they put that trade blotter, through some systematic review tool that they use to look for any number of, trading related issues, including best execution, but not limited to it, probably, cross trades and portfolio bumping and anything like that. They asked us whether accounts had directed brokerage arrangements. So we indicated, yes or no to that. But there wasn't much of a specific focus from best execution. I don't think they looked at our best execution meeting minutes or anything like that.
Okay, that's really good to know. So another question we have for you, which also relates to the specifics of your exam, is would you please describe the examination surrounding custody, such as what was asked or the documents given, etc.?
Yes, this is maybe a little bit of a lengthy one. Custody, it was, the custody is burdensome. There's a lot involved in custody. So, we provided the SEC, probably the biggest thing that we provided them was, a spreadsheet with all of these columns, and, each row was a client account of ours. So we had to put, something like 20 or so data points, probably being the columns for each account. And some of them were custody related. The SEC ended up doing, an asset verification with the custodians. We learned later, so we were asked for a list of all these client accounts, their custodian account numbers, and their account balances as of a certain date. And then, we later learned that the SEC actually followed up with the custodians and verified those assets, because in a couple of cases where their verification didn't immediately reconcile, they asked us in supplemental requests to explain why something wasn't matching up, which we were always able to do. So that was something that they were definitely focused on. Some of the other kind of custody related data points that we had to provide for each client account was whether we had custody over the assets in the account. Whether the custodian sends statements to the client and the format of delivery, whether electronic or physical mail, whether we directly debit fees from the account, among other items. Those were the custody focused items. Later in another follow-up, they dug, further into custody for a small sample of accounts, maybe 10 accounts or a dozen accounts. I don't remember the exact number, but a small subset of accounts. These are accounts, where we had indicated that we had a third-party standing letter of authorization, giving us custody. And the SEC asked for, I'm going to read this from the letter, actually, it's useful. They asked for, quote, documentation maintained by the advisor showing that the advisor has complied with the provisions outlined in the SEC's February 21st, 2017 no action letter. So that means for each of those accounts that they asked for, we provided the custodian's funds transfer agreement, which limited our authority to, on the account. We provided the custodian's annual and initial notices of third-party standing letters of authorization, and the custodian's transfer of funds notices that let it go out to the client when a third-party standing letter of authorization is used. We provided each of the third-party letters of authorization signed by the client. Then we provided internal memos that we have documenting how we comply with the no action letter, and a similar document, from the custodian, which says, this is how we comply with the portions of the no action letter that apply to us as custodian. And lastly, we provided the SEC a tracking spreadsheet that we maintain, with every standing letter of authorization that clients have on file. So custody there was a lot of work on custody, just in terms of the time that it took.
Interesting. It seems like custody was a bigger area of focus for your exam. Now, speaking of the exam, the SEC has said they are doing risk-based exams. Can you confirm that was your experience? And did you try to remediate any issues that came up during the exam? And then, if so, how did the SEC view those efforts?
So I guess let me start by saying I don't have any, certain way of knowing why we were examined, whether it was a risk-based exam, but based on, the facts surrounding our exam and my knowledge of, our firm's history and what we got in our request list, I would say that it probably was a risk-based exam. By that, I mean, our firm hadn't been examined for 15 years prior to 2020 when we had this exam. And I think that from the SEC's perspective, based on all of our filings with them, everything on our website, everything in the public sphere about us, our investment strategy, I think is likely viewed as very, low risk by the SEC. But surely one of the factors that they take into account when determining, when doing their risk analysis is the number of years since a firm was last examined. So I think for us, in our case, I think that was probably the big risk factor in our business, is that, we hadn't been examined in 15 years. And eventually that just kind of pushed us over to the side of the risk line where you get a letter in the mail and you do your exam. I guess the other reason that I say I think this was a risk-based exam was, our request list was very broadly focused, but not particularly deeply focused on any certain area. So it was pretty topical. And I guess as far as the questions about, the question about remediating any issues, I don't think, we didn't really have a lot of issues come up during the exam, thankfully. But, when we did, we had a couple miscommunications or misunderstandings or, some errors. Of course, you want to remediate any issues that come up as quickly as you can, and be transparent with the SEC, which is what we did. And I think they appreciated that transparency and attention to detail and, quick remediation of issues as they came up. I think that helped our kind of working relationship throughout the exam.
Oh, definitely. I think it really helps to work with the SEC hand in hand to complete the exam and just get everything done to the best of your abilities. Now, on to our last question today. Did your exam include any items regarding cybersecurity?
I was actually kind of surprised at how little focus there was on cybersecurity, especially, given that it feels like every year, you read the OC's exam priorities or focus areas, and it's, cyber is like drilled into us as compliance professionals. There was really nothing specifically looking at cyber in our exam. One of the things that they asked for was all of our compliance and operational policies and procedures. So that, of course, included our information security policy, vendor due diligence policy, anti-fraud policy, privacy notice, business continuity, disaster recovery plan. So all of those, kind of touch on cyber. We don't maintain a singular cyber specific plan because, it is kind of woven into all these other areas where we do have, plans and policies and procedures. So we provided all of that, and presumably the SEC was satisfied because it didn't ask any further follow-up questions on anything cyber related.
That's really interesting. It's definitely a little bit of a different experience from what Jeff had. And it just kind of goes to show how the SEC exam can change on a firm-to-firm basis, depending on what your firm looks like and how it operates. And Abe, I want to thank you again so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for having me, Caleb. I appreciate it.
Anytime, Abe. And with that, let's move on to our final interview of the day with my coworker and co-host, Krista Zipfel. Krista, thank you again so much for sitting down and answering some follow-up questions.
Thank you, Caleb.
Of course. Now, let's just jump right into it. Krista, our first question for you is, what is ESG?
Sure. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it's oftentimes used interchangeably with SRI or socially responsible investing. It's a kind of a catch-all term used for social, environmental, investing. One of the things is that the SEC, the Division of Examinations, when they came out with their 2021 exam priorities, that term ESG was used quite a bit in terms of the SEC's focus for 2021, that they plan to look at investment advisors in terms of what they're saying to their investors, in terms of what they're doing in the way of ESG conscious investing or socially responsible investing, sustainable investing, and whether what they're saying is matching up with what they're doing.
Oh, okay. So essentially what the SEC is checking is to make sure that what you're doing is actually what you're saying you're doing. Now, for our next question, a listener wanted to know if you have any suggestions for how to supervise employees who work remote other than reiterating policies through email and video calls.
Sure. So one of the things firms are doing is one, they're documenting where all their employees are so that they have clear documentation of where people are working from. And then in terms of kind of additional supervising practices, one of the things they're doing is giving additional resources to supervisors to hold, virtual meetings with the people they're supervising. So having kind of regular virtual meetings with camera on, being able to interact more that way to supplement, to replace what used to be in person. Now, they're doing it virtually, via, Zoom calls or things like that. With the video on, it's one way to do that. Also, firms are updating their policies to reflect what used to be paper reviews of documents or practices. That process may have changed, and so firms are adopting new ways of documenting, let's say, electronic review of, let's say, client state, reports and things of that nature. Also, firms are adopting new attestations for their employees that are working remotely, to have employees attest to the things they're doing. Also, firms are, just increasing the number of reviews, increasing the kind of monitoring that they're doing, increasing, let's say, the frequency of email reviews, keyword searches, things of that nature. And then when they're doing branch office type of inspections, again, if the on-site's no longer feasible, they're doing like webcam type of audits. So those are some of the ways firms are trying to supervise remote employees.
Got it. So it seems like there are some additional workarounds and other ways to address the issue with supervising and monitoring employees who are working remote. Now, our third question is, can you provide any guidance on employee crypto accounts, for example, River or Coinbase apps and websites? And then do these have to be monitored?
Sure. So I think the first challenge for firms is identifying whether they're dealing with a cash equivalent or a security. So some Coinbase accounts are, basically cash equivalents, and then other cryptocurrencies are really initial coin offerings, or they're deemed securities. So the first challenge for firms is identifying whether they're dealing with, a cash equivalent or an actual security, because cash does not have to be reported or monitored, but securities are subject to the Code of Ethics rule and reporting and monitoring, depending on the nature, depending on the policy that the firm has adopted. So that's the first challenge firms need to deal with. If they, feel that they don't want to try to figure out whether something is, cash or security, they may adopt a policy to just have everything reported to be safe, that they're not missing something that is in fact a security. And then if firms do require, the reporting of all securities, not just IPOs or private placements, then they need to make sure that they, report those securities as well. And then it also may depend on the firm. If the firm trades in those types of securities, then the need to monitor that employee participation is obviously of a greater conflict and risk. And so firms should probably be doing that. But if a firm does not in any way, shape, or form invest in those types of securities, then their monitoring may be more to the point of whether the employee is spending their time, trading in those securities rather than taking care of client accounts. So every firm needs to, determine for themselves what is appropriate with respect to those securities, and it can differ from firm to firm.
Thanks, Krista. Crypto has been talked about so much this past year, so I'm really glad we were able to discuss it. Now, moving on to the next question, the person asking this one was about to submit a request for a staff opinion on the application of the custody rule to a specific situation. Do you have any thoughts on whether periodic requests for staff opinions either trigger or defer an examination?
So I don't have any specific experience with a firm, having done that and then it triggering exam or having any impact on an exam. But if a firm is at all concerned about that, I do have some suggestions. You could have a question submitted, effectively anonymously, through your legal counsel, through a compliance consultant you work with, or if you're a member of NSCP or the Investment Advisors Association, those organizations also submit questions to the regulators and can submit those on your behalf. So that's one way of, maintaining, so to speak, your anonymity in asking the question. So that would be an option, but I've not experienced, but then I don't know that I can think of any situation where we asked a specific question or an advisor asked a specific question that led to an exam or had an impact on an exam.
That's really helpful to hear. Since we're on the subject of custody, let's jump to our next question, which is, in your opinion, would participating in a surprise custody audit each year help with the custody asset questions?
I mean, certainly, if a firm chose to have surprise custody audits each year, even if they weren't required, I mean, anytime you do more than you have to, that certainly helps. But that's a significant expense to undergo for a firm that is not subject or required to have surprise custody audits.
Well, that's good to hear. You might have just saved a firm a lot of money. And since we're talking about money, let's talk about charging clients. In this case, the viewer wanted to know, is it okay to have clients that do not get charged?
So absolutely, advisors can choose not to charge certain clients, and many advisors do. I do strongly recommend that you disclose in your ADV when you do have clients. In fact, I worked for an advisor at one point in time where they had certain clients that they did not charge, and then the SEC did instruct them to put some disclosure in their ADV around the clients that they didn't charge. And so I've typically with firms, oftentimes it's family member accounts, related persons, or they might be very small college savings accounts, things of that nature. There's a lot of different reasons why firms choose not to charge. We did have one advisor, he literally, I think he traded haircuts with his hairdresser. And so it was kind of a quid pro quo. And, we simply just disclosed that in the ADV so that there's full disclosure around when you don't charge certain clients.
Oh, wow. Haircuts? That sounds like a great trade-off. Moving on to our next question, which was simply stated as PPP loans. So, Krista, can you maybe address PPP loans, give a description of them, and then talk about disclosure and potentially paying them back?
Yeah, that's a good question, Caleb. Last year when firms were taking out PPP loans, there was a lot of discussion around whether it needed to be disclosed, where disclosed, how disclosed. So some firms didn't take loans. Some firms took loans and felt that it was not required to be disclosed. Some firms took the PPP loans and disclosed it in item 18 of their ADV, but didn't deem it material. And yet other firms took the PPP loans, deemed it material, disclosed it in item 2 of ADV 2A, and notified their clients of that material change to their ADV. Now we're coming to the time when loans are either being paid back or forgiven, and firms are asking, what they need to do in terms of their disclosure now. And so if the firm has paid back the loan, or if the loan's been forgiven, it's my belief that there's no longer a reason to include that disclosure on your ADV going forward. However, the instructions to the ADV Part 2A state that in item 2, you must include any material changes since the last annual update to your ADV. So for any firm that included disclosure around the PPP loans in item 2 of their Form ADV, generally firms took those loans, oftentimes the disclosure was added in like May or June of last year. So that was after most firms' annual updating amendment last year. And so it still needs to remain for this annual updating amendment, this go around, and can be removed with the next amendment to the Form ADV.
Got it. That sounds like a great plan. Our next two questions are related to the New York IARs. So the first question is, does an RIA need to register if their place of business is in another state, but they have clients in New York?
Sure. So let me just kind of give a overview. So if an investment advisor does not have a place of business in New York, doesn't have any IARs in New York, and doesn't have any clients in New York, then there's no need to register the firm or any individual in New York. If an SEC advisor does not have a place of business in New York and doesn't have an investment advisor representatives in New York, then they would notice file in New York if they have 6 or more clients in New York. And similarly for a state advisor, if they don't have a place of business in New York and they don't have any investment advisor reps in New York, they would register if they have 6 or more clients in New York. Now, if an advisor has a person located in New York, then it begs the question, do they not have a place of business in New York? And we would recommend that firms look at, if they're in any way, shape, or form holding out an office, whether it be on their website, on their ADV, on an individual's business card, and whether they're meeting with clients or prospective clients in New York, then they would be holding themselves out and would have a place of business in New York, and that would trigger the firm to either notice, file, or register, depending on whether it's state or SEC. Now, with respect to an investment advisor representative, if they're a federally registered advisor, so SEC registered, they would need to look at the definition of investment advisor rep, the SEC definition of an investment advisor rep, as to whether they meet that definition and need to register the IAR in New York. And if they're a state advisor, then they need to look to the New York State definition of an investment advisor representative as to whether they have to register that person.
All right. And then, as a follow-up to that, our last question is, does an SEC registered firm with a place of business in New York need to have its marketing personnel registered in New York as IARs?
Sure. So since the firm is SEC registered, an SEC firm would look at the SEC definition of an investment advisor representative. And generally speaking, the way that definition is written, I have not seen that to include marketing persons in that definition of an investment advisor representative. But firms do need to just look at the SEC definition of an IAR. But that definition goes into, that person having clients, holding clients, and marketing personnel typically do not meet that definition.
Thank you, Krista. And again, thank you so much for helping answer all these questions. I know a lot of these topics are areas of discussion that come up a lot, and it's so helpful to have someone address them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Caleb. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Of course, Krista. And that is all for today. We hope that we provided you some excellent guidance and perspective on compliance today. And thank you again to Abe, Jeff, and SS&C Admin for helping put on a wonderful webinar. Make sure to check out our supplement where you can see the questions we asked Abe, Jeff, and Krista, as well as an initial request list from the SEC. Now that's all we have for today. Make sure to like and subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on LinkedIn. Have a great day, everyone. Class dismissed.